going to unpack these concepts of cases and attributes and classifications.
We're going to try to give you like a shortcut, almost like a cheat sheet, so you can really start using these tools in your own research.
Exactly. Because when you get this stuff, it can totally change the game. The chapters basically say, okay, you've got all this raw data, like your interviews, your surveys, your field notes. Now what?
Right. And it's not just about making it neat and tidy. It's about turning it into something that you can actually analyze.
So you can actually find meaning, make discoveries.
Yeah, you start to see how even something as simple as someone's age or their job can unlock these super interesting comparisons.
It can get pretty deep. We're going to try and equip you with some really solid analytical techniques so you feel empowered, not overwhelmed by all this stuff.
Right on. So let's jump right in. This whole idea of a case, it's kind of the foundation of everything. What's the chapter telling us about cases?
It's basically saying a case is like this container, right? It's where you gather absolutely everything related to one specific thing you're studying, one specific unit.
Okay, and what kinds of things are we talking about here? Like, could you give some concrete examples?
For sure. The chapter talks about a few different possibilities. So a case could be each person you interviewed would be their own case.
That's pretty intuitive.
Yeah, but it could also be a place. Like if you're studying different communities, each community could be a case.
Gotcha.
Or even think about this, a case could be a policy, like if you're analyzing government regulations.
Okay, so it's really flexible. Now, how does a case differ from a code? Because they both kind of sound like ways of organizing stuff, right?
That is so important to distinguish. They're both part of the system, but they serve different purposes. A case is the actual unit itself, like the person, the place, the policy. A code, on the other hand, is a label for a concept or a theme you find within the data.
Okay, I see.
So like trust could be a code or economic impact could be a code. Those aren't the things themselves, but they're ideas that are coming up in your interviews or your observations.
Gotcha. So it's like the thing versus the idea about the thing.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So if I've done, say, 20 interviews, I would have 20 cases.
Exactly. Each person would be their own case. And within each case, you can keep all sorts of stuff. The interview transcript, of course, any notes you took, maybe recordings if you have those.
Makes sense.
And this is important demographic information about that person.
Oh, yeah, like their age, their job, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And the chapter really stresses that you want to be super clear about what your cases are from the very beginning. That's a fundamental step.
Right. Why is that so crucial?
Because your whole analysis is going to be built on these cases. If you're not crystal clear about what each case represents, your comparisons are going to get all messed up later.
You're going to be comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly. So you want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. All right, moving on. The chapter then dives into case types and classifications. I feel like this is where it can get a bit tricky for folks.
Yeah, but the terminology can be a little dense.
Totally. So case types are basically broader categories for your cases. So you might have a case type called people, and then within that, you'd have all your individual people as cases.
Check.
And then you might have another case type called, say, organizations, and each organization you study would be a case within that type.
That makes sense.
And then classifications, especially if you're using software like NVivo, this is how the software represents those case types. So you'd actually set up a classification called people and another one called organizations in the program.
And these classifications then hold the attributes, which we'll talk about in a sec.
Exactly. So let's look at some examples from the chapter. For the case type people, they suggest attributes like role and years of experience.
Okay, those were pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and then the values for role could be things like doctor, nurse, patient, and so on.
Right.
And for communities, as a case type, another example, a relevant attribute, could be geographic location, with values like coastal, island, or landlocked.
So you're basically creating these categories and subcategories to organize everything.
Exactly. And the cool thing is the chapter points out that one piece of data can actually be linked to multiple cases, even across different case types.
Whoa, really? How does that work?
So imagine you interview someone, let's call her Sarah. Her interview transcript would obviously be part of the Sarah case under the people classification.
Right.
But let's say Sarah talks a lot about her experiences living in a specific neighborhood. Parts of her interview could also be linked to a case for that neighborhood under a places classification. So the same data can inform your understanding of both the person and the place.
That's really powerful.
It is, but there's a really important caveat here, which the chapter highlights. Within the same case type, the data should be mutually exclusive. So Sarah's interview should only be in the Sarah case under people, not also in, like, the John case under people.
Okay, that makes sense. So you can connect across case types, but within a case type, it's got to be one-to-one.
Precisely.
So to sum up this whole system, it's like this, right? You have classifications, which are like the big buckets.
Right.
Then within each classification, you have attributes, which are like the specific characteristics you're looking at.
Right.
And then those attributes have values, which are the specific data points.
Nailed it. So you could have the people classification, the age attribute, and then the values could be 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on.
And those values are what you actually assign to each case, each individual person in this example.
Exactly. It's like a hierarchy going from broad to specific.
Okay, that makes it much clearer. Now, let's dig deeper into these attributes and values. The chapter kind of compares attributes to variables in quantitative research.
Yeah, they're definitely serving a similar function. An attribute is basically any characteristic or piece of information about your cases that you want to analyze systematically.
And the chapter uses occupation as an example.
Right. So occupation is the attribute, and then the values could be teacher, engineer, artist, whatever jobs your participants have.
Okay, that's pretty clear.
Yeah.
And how do you actually connect those values back to the individual cases?
It's pretty straightforward. Each case has its own set of values for its attributes. So participant A might have teacher as the value for occupation and female for the value for gender and so on.
Makes sense. Now, the chapter mentions that you can actually create these attributes at any point in your analysis. You don't have to have them all figured out beforehand.
That's a really good point. It really depends on your style and your research question. Some people like to have it all mapped out from the start.
I'm that way. Give you the structure.
Me too, actually. But others find that it's more organic to develop these categories as they go along. It's kind of like you start noticing patterns in your data, and that's what leads you to create certain attributes.
Yeah, I can see how that could work too. But whether you do it at the start or later on, what's important to remember about the nature of these attribute values?
The chapter really emphasizes that the attribute values should capture relatively stable information about the case. It's not about capturing every single detail or nuance, but rather the kind of baseline characteristics that are known about that case.
So it's not necessarily about what they say in the interview, but more about who they are.
Exactly, like their age, their education level, their job, those sorts of things. And it might not even be something they explicitly mention. You might have gotten that info from a survey or a database or something.
Gotcha. Now, the chapter gives some really helpful examples beyond basic demographics. What are some other kinds of information you could capture as attributes?
Ooh, so many possibilities. You could capture things like the size of an organization, if your cases are organizations, or maybe the type of community they live in. You can use scales, like if you ask people to rate their level of satisfaction on a survey.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
And you can even use your own coding as a source for attributes. So let's say you've coded for instances where people express frustration. You could create an attribute called expressed frustration and then just assign yes or no to each case.
That's clever. It's like turning your codes into attributes.
Exactly. And it's important to remember the chapter brings this up again, the difference between codes and attributes. Codes are for specific chunks of data. Attributes are for the case as a whole.
Okay, so why go through all this trouble? What's the payoff of having all these attributes set up?
It's all about comparison. Once you have the structured data, you can start running queries to compare different groups. You can see if there are patterns in how people of different ages or occupations or whatever talk about certain themes.
So, like, I could see what people in their 20s said about climate change versus people in their 50s.
Exactly. And you can do this using tools in qualitative software like NVivo. They have these things called crosstabs and matrix coding queries that let you do just that.
Those sound fancy. How do they work?
They're basically tables. Your codes, your themes become the rows of the table. And then the values of an attribute like age group, for example, become the columns. And then in each cell, you see how many references or cases fall into that combination.
Oh, I see. So I could have a table where the rows are themes like environmental concerns and economic concerns, and the columns are 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on.
Exactly. And then you'd see like how many times people in each age group talked about environmental versus economic concerns.
And then if I want to actually read what they said.
You can usually just double-click on a cell, and it'll show you all the text or media that's coded that way.
That's so cool. So I can see the patterns and the actual data behind those patterns.
Exactly, and that's what leads to the real insights, right? The chapter talks about using sets, too, another handy tool. Sets are basically groupings of files, codes, or cases that you create for specific purposes. So imagine you interview the same people twice. You could create a set for the first round of interviews and another set for the second round.
Oh, interesting. So I could compare what people said at time 1 versus time 2.
Exactly. Or let's say you have a really complex case, like you're studying a program, and you have interviews with staff, participants, and observers. You could create sets for each of those groups.
And you could look at their perspectives separately, or you could compare them.
Exactly. And sets are dynamic, so if you code something new or change a file, the set updates automatically.
That's super helpful. So just to recap, what are the key takeaways here?
Okay, so cases are your units of analysis. They hold all the data for that unit.
Got it.
You have classifications to organize your cases.
Right.
Within each classification, you have attributes, which are the specific characteristics you're looking at. And each attribute has values, which are the specific data points for each case.
Got it.
And the whole point of this is to enable comparison, to help you see the patterns and connections in your data.
It's not just about describing what's there. It's about figuring out why it's there and what it means.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest takeaway is that this approach can really take you from feeling overwhelmed by a ton of data to feeling like you can actually start to understand it.
Right. You're not just swimming in a sea of information anymore. You've got a structure, a framework.
Exactly. And that's when those aha moments start to happen.
Now, I want you to think about your own research.
Mm.
What are the key units that you're studying? And what are some of the characteristics that might be really important for understanding those units? Like, are there certain demographic factors, certain experiences, certain contexts that might be key?
Take a minute to really consider that, because when you start to see your data through this lens, you can unlock some really profound insights. And this is really just the beginning. There's so much more you can do with these tools, so many more ways to dig into your data and really make sense of it.
Absolutely. So keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep asking those tough questions.